Hello and welcome to the second lecture on maritime zones and the law of the sea. I hope you're feeling well and you're ready to do some learning. This lecture will be focused on maritime boundaries and disputes between different coastal states about their boundary locations. The learning outcomes for this lecture are, first of all, to understand the mechanism for the determination of maritime boundaries. Secondly, to appreciate that the determination of maritime boundaries can generate disputes. And finally, to recognise the main mechanisms through which maritime boundary disputes are overcome. So we're going to start this lecture by looking at how we delimit or designate maritime boundaries. Now, this is a topic that often generates a great deal of debate and occasionally conflict. This is because the resources found in maritime zones can be very valuable, and the authority given to coastal states over marine space through the designation of maritime zones is important in the protection and security of coastal states. The law of the sea is very clear in most situations regarding how to claim maritime zones and how to define maritime zones, as discussed in our previous lecture. However, there are some situations in which the application of the law of the sea is more challenging. And we're going to look at three of those today. The first one is where coastal states are less than 400 nautical miles apart and a median line must be identified between them. The second situation is when the maritime zone has the potential to be expanded by the existence of islands. And the third situation is where the land from which the maritime zone is defined is of disputed sovereignty. First, we'll start in situations in which coastal states are less than 400 nautical miles apart. If coastal states are more than 400 nautical miles apart, each state can claim a full 200 nautical mile EEZ, and in that situation, there's not really a problem. However, if the coastal states are less than 400 nautical miles apart, then agreement must be reached to define an agreed boundary. This boundary is called the median line. The median line is the midpoint between the baselines of each coastal state. Once agreed, the median line becomes the international maritime boundary between coastal states. The map on the screen shows the North Sea and the maritime areas associated with each of the North Sea's coastal states. Where each of the maritime zones meet, this is a median line. As coastal states want to maximize their marine resources, the definition of the median line can sometimes be contentious. Looking at the map of the North Sea on the screen and the maritime boundaries of the coastal states surrounding the North Sea, you'll notice that the maritime zones reflect broadly the geography of the coastal states concerned. Countries such as Belgium and the Netherlands have quite small exclusive economic zones, and interestingly, Germany has a very small exclusive economic zone because, in effect, it's squashed into the bottom right-hand corner of the North Sea. The United Kingdom has a very large exclusive economic zone because it is a long distance from Norway, particularly in the northwest of the North Sea. Therefore, to a certain extent, it's the surrounding geography that controls the maritime zones that specific coastal states can claim. So let's look at an example of how we construct a median line. Well, here we have two coastal states that are less than 400 nautical miles apart. Thinking about how we define maritime zones from our previous lecture, we know that the first thing we must do is add on a baseline. So let's do that. I hope you'll remember from our previous lecture that the baseline effectively straightens the coastline and allows the maritime zones to be measured forward from the coastline in a much more efficient and effective way. So going back to the construction of the median line. We've got the baselines in place, which allows us to measure forwards. So let's draw some lines from each of the coastal states across their shared marine space. Where those lines cross, that is the midpoint between each of the two baselines. Let's just identify those points by adding some dots. We can then join those dots together and remove the rest of the lines to leave us with the median line. So in this example, the median line shows us precisely the midpoint between the two baselines of the coastal states concerned. So looking at this chart, we see the median line there, and it does look a little bit like the coastal state on the right has got a larger maritime area than the coastal state on the left. However, this is not really the case. The median line, we must remember, is the line halfway between the two baselines, not halfway between the two coastlines. In the case of the coastal state on the right, the coastline is very indented, and the baseline is a long way in front of the coastline in certain places, giving a large area of internal waters. It's always important to remember that the median line is halfway between the baselines, not the coastlines. So that is how we construct a median line for coastal states that are less than 400 nautical miles apart. The second situation we will examine is islands. An island, according to the law of the sea, is defined as a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water, which is above water at high tide. Islands are able to claim their own maritime zones. In contrast, rocks, and again I quote from the law of the sea, which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own, do not have maritime zones associated with them. Artificial islands, structures and installations also do not have their own maritime zones. Some coastal states try to populate islands to justify greater claim over maritime zones and the resources inside them. For example, coral atolls in the South China Sea have been extended and populated to meet the island criteria in the law of the sea and hence generate maritime zones. Similarly, overseas territories can be a significant contributor to the maritime area of a coastal state. This has benefits, including access to resources and military influence. The island on the screen is Tristan da Cunha, which is a British overseas territory located in the South Atlantic. This island is habitable and can sustain economic life. Therefore, it is able to generate its own maritime zone. As the island is a British overseas territory, then the maritime zone is available to the British government for exploitation and use. In this way, countries that are relatively small or have relatively limited maritime zones can extend their maritime area significantly by claiming maritime zones around islands and around their overseas territories. Portugal is a classic example of this. The EEZ associated with Portugal's mainland has an area of 322,200 square kilometres. The Portuguese Madeira Islands in the North Atlantic have an EEZ of 454,500 square kilometres. Even more impressive is the EEZ of the Portuguese Azores Islands, which has an area of just over 1 million square kilometres. So the EEZ generated by mainland Portugal is relatively small compared to the EEZs generated by Portugal's islands. Similarly, France has a mainland EEZ area of approximately 335,000 square kilometres, whilst France's total EEZ, including overseas territories and islands, is over 11 million square kilometres, which is the second largest EEZ of any country in the world after the United States. The vast majority of France's EEZ is generated by its islands and overseas territories. This illustrates that islands and overseas territories can be a significant contributor to a country's maritime area, and thus its economy and security. The third topic that presents challenges to the law of the sea is areas of disputed sovereignty. Generally, the identification of maritime zones and rights to use the marine resources within them are fairly clear under the law of the sea. However, there are some territories, generally islands, that have disputed sovereignty. It is therefore not clear which country should have access to the resources within the maritime zones associated with the disputed territories. Given their potentially important strategic and military role, and the valuable economic resources within maritime zones, the sovereignty of disputed territories is often a source of tension and sometimes conflict between countries. An example of this is the islands of the South China Sea, such as the Spratly Islands, shown on the screen, that are claimed by several countries, including China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. In terms of the claims that China, Vietnam, and the Philippines have on the Spratly Islands, in broad terms, China says its right to the area comes from 2,000 years of history, where the Spratly chain was regarded as integral to the Chinese nation. Vietnam says it has actively ruled over the Spratlys since the 17th century, and the Philippines invokes its geographical proximity to the Spratly Islands as the main basis for its claim for part of the grouping. The disputed island territories in the South China Sea has led to the militarization and settlement of islands to support the maritime claims of these coastal states. One such example is Titu Island. You can see on the screen right now a satellite image showing a group of coral atolls which were previously unsettled. In order to meet the definition of an island, you'll see from the image on the screen that an airstrip has been built and a small population moved onto the island to illustrate it can sustain human life and develop its own economy. Under the terms of the law of the sea, now that this island meets the definition of an island, it can generate its own maritime zones, including an exclusive economic zone. It is therefore clearly in the best interests of coastal states with a claim over disputed territory to settle those islands and therefore make a claim for the marine resources to which they would be entitled. What we're going to do now is work through an example of how the law of the sea can deal with disputed territories. So on the screen we see Land A. Over 200 nautical miles from the coastline of Land A is an island. So, interpreting the law of the sea here is relatively straightforward. We place a baseline across the front of Land A, from which we can measure maritime boundaries. We know the island is over 200 nautical miles away, so Land A can generate its own exclusive economic zone relatively simply. However, in this example, we also have Land B. Going through the same process, we put a baseline on Land B, and that allows us to measure our maritime zones. So, putting on the exclusive economic zone of Land B, we have this situation. We have a situation where Land A and Land B are over 400 nautical miles apart, but lying between them outside of both of their EEZs is an island of disputed territory. Land A thinks it owns the island, and Land B thinks it owns the island. Just to make things more complicated, the island just happens to sit on top of a very significant oil field that both Land A and Land B would love to access. So, let's work through this example a little bit further. The first thing we'll do is consider how the maritime zone of the island interacts with the maritime zones of Land A and Land B. So first, let's superimpose the EEZ of the island onto the chart. Clearly, the island's EEZ overlaps with the EEZ of each of the two coastal states, A and B. So first, let us test out how the EEZ would look if the sovereignty of the island was awarded to Land B. Pause the presentation and think about how the resultant EEZ would appear. Think about all you've learned, including about baselines and the median line. Take a moment to sketch an image of how the resultant EEZ would look. Okay, so how did you do? Were you able to figure it out, or at least come up with an answer of some sort? Well, let's think through it. The first thing we must always do when measuring maritime zones is to think about the baseline. As the baseline is the point from which everything else is measured, this is really the starting point every time. In this example, we know the baselines that we need already exist. We can see the baseline for Land B, and we know that the island has got an exclusive economic zone already identified. Therefore, a baseline must exist for that to be measured. So in this example, in actual fact, we don't really need to worry or be concerned about the baseline. So the next thing to think about is whether or not we need to include any median lines on this chart. Well, hopefully you identified that we do. The median line we need is due to the overlap between the EEZ of Land A and the EEZ of the island. So you'll notice that the EEZ of the island extends into Land A's EEZ. So we need to identify the midpoint boundary through that overlap. So I'm just going to grey out the EEZ of the island and superimpose the median line. So here we go. Of course, the median line will mean that the boundary between the island's EEZ and Land A's EEZ changes, so we can remove the existing boundary as follows. So, the final EEZ for Land B would look like this. You will see from the chart how the resultant EEZ adds significantly to the maritime area of Land B. It increases its access to important resources, increases its influence on the area, and supports its own security. It also slightly reduces the maritime area of Land A due to the calculation of a median line, resulting from the additional EEZ claim associated with the island. So what we see on the screen now are the exclusive economic zones of Land A and Land B if Land B was awarded the sovereignty of the disputed island. What I'd like you to do now is pause the presentation and think about how the EEZs would look if Land A was given sovereignty over the island. Spend a few minutes to draw a sketch map of how you think the zones would look. Good luck. Okay, how did you do? Well, I hope you thought about the baselines. I hope you thought about any median lines that might be needed. And I imagine and hope you came up with a diagram that looks a little bit like this. The image shows how the EEZ of both Land A and B would look if Land A was awarded sovereignty of the island. In this situation, the coastal state on the left, Land A, obtains all of the benefits that the other coastal state would have received if it had sovereignty over the island. The example we've just worked through demonstrates clearly the potential for disagreement and conflict over disputed territories, as the benefits of sovereignty are potentially significant. And in a way, the law of the sea has both created and solved these problems. It solved problems such as these through providing a structured framework to identify which coastal states can claim what in the marine environment, but also by awarding maritime zones to islands that are sometimes disputed. It's intensified the political and sometimes military struggle to claim islands that otherwise would have limited value to coastal states. Potential mechanisms to determine the precise maritime boundaries and sovereignty of disputed territories can include precise hydrographic survey and geospatial analysis, historical review, political negotiation, and sometimes even military action. Under the terms of the law of the sea, there are 4 formal processes to resolve settlements of disputes of this sort. There is the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. This situation could be dealt with by the International Court of Justice. An arbitral tribunal could be constituted in accordance with Annex 7 to the Convention, or a special arbitral tribunal could be constituted in accordance with Annex 8. These arbitral tribunals are essentially specific decision-making processes to resolve specific problems. However, in practice, all 4 of these options can take a very long time to reach a resolution, and the coastal states concerned may not even then accept their outcome. So this brings us to the end of the lecture. In this lecture, we've looked at 3 particularly challenging situations to determine maritime boundaries. The first learning outcome was to understand the mechanism for the determination of maritime boundaries. We did this through examining how median lines are constructed. The second learning outcome was to appreciate that the determination of maritime boundaries can generate disputes. We did this through looking at the South China Sea and specifically Titu Island. The final learning outcome was to recognise the main mechanisms through which we can overcome maritime boundary disputes. We illustrated this point through the example of Land A and Land B. In this example, it was clear that whichever coastal state was awarded the sovereignty of the island would benefit considerably in comparison to the other coastal state. We noted that it was hardly surprising, therefore, that coastal states do not necessarily agree with the formal arbitration processes that the law of the sea has in place. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned a little bit more than you knew already about the law of the sea, and I hope you recognise how the law of the sea is both beneficial and causes problems for the management